Welcome back. We're gonna get into the fight file, the 65-64 fight file. As you know, as I told you before in the other videos, I got the fight file from the Department of Justice, and the fight file that I got was mainly about, or is mainly about, the Nation of Islam. As I said before, the 64-65 fights were investigated by J. Edgar Hoover. So he had already found out through his wiretapping and his infiltration of the boxing commissions that the fights were not fixed. And his main emphasis, his main concern was the Nation of Islam. He considered they were enemy number one. And so he was focused on the Nation of Islam because J. Edgar Hoover felt that the Nation of Islam was a hate group. And one of his focuses was not only Malcolm X, but Muhammad Ali, because Muhammad Ali was a spokesman. If you read the fight file, you'll see, as I'll get into later down the road, that I'll discuss some of the fight file down the road. But they really hated the Nation of Islam. J. Edgar Hoover and FBI hated the Nation of Islam. They despised Malcolm X, and they despised Muhammad Ali. So let's see why in my book, Beast, The Deconstruction of Charles Sonny Liston, I talk about the Nation of Islam in depth, and why they considered, through my research, I wanted to know why they considered Mr. Ali so dangerous. And we're going to get into my book, my Amazon book, and we're going to find out why he was so dangerous. So here we go, from my book, Beast, The Deconstruction of Charles Sonny Liston. I'm just going to read from my book my thoughts on this whole issue of the Nation of Islam, the FBI, and their wiretapping program, and why they felt that they needed to watch Muhammad Ali. I'm the king of the world. I am the greatest. I am Muhammad Ali. I shook up the world. I am the king of the world. That was a quote by Muhammad Ali after he beat Sonny Liston in the first fight, 1964 fight. Basically ran to the press and said those words. Again, I will read them again. I am the king of the world. I am the greatest. I'm Muhammad Ali. I shook up the world. I'm the king of the world. One day I just started thinking, what in the world did these statements Cassius Clay was making have to do with boxing? I began asking myself, what did Cassius Clay actually mean by saying, I'm the king of the world? I shook up the world. And why did he change his name to Muhammad Ali? Why didn't anyone else over the years notice this contradiction in terms? Or did they? Was Cassius Clay trying to make a political statement? I mean, he did run straight to the press after the first Liston fight to express those exact words. There was a change occurring in society in the 1960s. Some would call it a paradigm shift. And what is a paradigm shift but a change in the worldview? It wasn't just a Black Power movement happening in America at that time, but there was a generational change occurring, a youth movement occurring, and every revolution throughout history begins with its youth. And I quote, Thus, a struggle was born between those who would be rulers and those who simply refused to be ruled by powers outside themselves. The state and the sovereign individual have been at war with each other as long as they have existed, because they cannot coexist with one another, as one entity seeks ever increasing dominion and resources, whilst the other cares primarily for what is in its own interest as defined solely by itself. With each entity being at cross purposes with the other, the only resolution possible is that one or the other should perish. End quote. Cassius Clay was young, and he was also very articulate. Sonny Liston, who came across as a bit shy, quiet, and docile. Sonny gave Black people an eerily reminder of Stepin Fetchit or an Amos and Andy. Sonny's public persona had a lot to do with his inability to read and write. Cassius Clay, on the other hand, was young, irreverent, rebellious, vibrant, and energetic. Cassius Clay had an in-your-face attitude that was new, refreshing, and in step with the times. He reminded the powers that be, people like J. Edgar Hoover and of the FBI, Negrophobes, Southern political strategists, and white industrialists of the strength, courage, and fortitude of Black people. Especially after the bombings by the Ku Klux Klan in 1963 at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, that killed 4 African-American children. Black people at that time were looking for a new face to represent their new attitude, a new leader who could stand in the face of the oppressor and say, "We will not be moved." It seemed as though Cassius Clay was cast out of the same mold as Nathaniel Turner, Gabriel Prosser, and Toussaint Louverture. Apologize for that pronunciation. I'm not French. But anyway, Sonny Liston represented everything that was old, a remnant of the Jim Crow South who was unconsciously killed by the friendly fire of a Black consciousness movement. As my grandmother Geraldine Liston would put it, Sonny was the champion that nobody wanted. Sonny gave fodder to the race science theory that a person's physical attributes, skin color, hair texture, nose shape, stature, or the like, compelled that person to speak or behave in a particular way. So in many ways, we as Black people were made to feel ashamed of Sonny Liston because of the effects of this same science on our own psyches. Cassius Clay was articulating not only the needs of Black people, but articulating the needs of his generation. Take, for example, the majority white Chicago 10, who had as one of their members Bobby Seale, who was also a founding member of the Black Panther Party. What is the greatest influence on the worldview? Language. Language encodes the worldview. Was Cassius Clay trying to change the worldview? And why did he run to the press after the first fight with Sonny Liston? I quote, "The media have a strong social and cultural impact upon society. This is predicated upon their ability to reach a wide audience with a strong and influential message. Marshall McLuhan uses the phrase, the medium is the message, as a means of explaining how the distribution of a message can often be more important than the content of the message itself. End quote. Was Cassius Clay sending a message to the world and to Black people that they should not believe the lie that Black people are the descendants of Ham? Was Cassius Clay trying to set the Black people free by telling us the truth? The truth that Black people are the descendants of kings. African Americans have a history of sending coded messages in their language and through their dances, especially in Negro spirituals. Wade in the water, wade in the waters, children. Wade in the waters. God's gonna trouble the waters. Black people did not sing because they were happy and content with their lot in life. Like Uncle Remus in the Walt Disney movie, The Song of the South. Black people sang because they hated slavery for killing their children before the ages of 5 and 9 years old. They sang because they were trying to let other forced African immigrants know that they were going to wade in the water and cross over to the Underground Railroad and escape to freedom with the Brown family and Harriet Tubman. Just the mention of Black people as kings of the world would begin to change their cognitive thinking and begin to deconstruct the archetype myth created by centuries of racist propaganda, threatening the socialization of white and Black people who were conditioned to hate each other and feel superior and inferior to each other because of 350 years of slavery, 100 years of legally enforced segregation, and decades of racial discrimination and prejudice in every facet of life. The question we must ask ourselves is who or what was using the strategy of race to divide the masses, and what was their ultimate motive? Why was it necessary to socialize Americans to believe that they were superior or inferior to one another solely based on skin pigmentation? The most dangerous Black man in America at that time was not a Black man with a gun, but a Black man with a conscience. A thinking Black man could now threaten the racist construct begun by Aristotle and Plato and maintained for thousands of years just by mentioning the words, "I'm the greatest. I'm too pretty. I'm Black and beautiful. Say it loud. I'm Black and I'm proud." Who was courting Cassius Clay before the first Liston fight? He was being groomed by the Nation of Islam to become Muhammad Ali, and Malcolm X was his best friend. Why did he use the word king? Was Cassius Clay trying to change the perception of how people thought of American Negroes? He had stated that Cassius Clay was a slave name and that he would no longer go by that name again. From Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali, and I quote, "I am not what you call me. I'm what I respond to." African proverb, end quote. Rename a newly enslaved person. This is the way in which a master asserted the destruction of a slave's old identity and the imposition of a new one. Slave ship anchored off the coast of Africa. 1797, first African man and woman brought on board were also named Adam and Eve. Names for newly created people. Robert King Carter, one of the largest 18th century planners of the Chesapeake area, remarked, I named them here and instructed that the overseers should take care that the Negroes always go by ye names we gave. I had a professor tell me that maybe Cassius Clay was not conscious of the fact that he was encoding the word king into the worldview. I explained to the professor that ideology was both conscious and unconscious. And I quote, enslaved people resisted this renaming practice in countless ways. The modes of resistance varied with time and place. During the early years of the North American slavery, many enslaved people retained their African names among themselves, especially on large plantations, end quote. Cassius Clay said, I shook up the world. Was he unconsciously or consciously referring to another time and place? Black power was a conceptual idea in the 60s and 70s. For power to be actualized, it must first be seen. There were successful and unsuccessful attempts at Black power with the slave rebellions of Gabriel Prosser, Nat Turner, John Brown, Amistad, first American settlers at Pee Wee River, and of Toussaint Louverture, to name a few. I apologize for my bad French pronunciation. But he led the rebellion in Haiti, the slave rebellion in Haiti, and won. But anyway, I digress. But if I'm right about Cassius Clay being either conscious or unconscious of what he was saying, then he must have been referring to a specific time period. If Clay was encoding the words, I am the king of the world and I shook up the world, into the new construct, then when was the last time Black power was first actualized? When was the last time Black power shook up the world? Cassius Clay must have been referring to ancient Africa, a time when the Moors and the Numidian kings were defending North Africa from the foreign invaders. And I quote, civilization came to North Africa with the Canaanite traders from Tyre and Sidon, their language Phoenician, later called Punic in the Western Mediterranean, closely related to Hebrew. They began exploring the coast of the West in the late 2nd millennium BC. In 264 to 241 BC, the Greeks, Phoenicians, Romans, and French had set their minds on colonizing Africa. Their goal was to control the trade routes between North Africa and Sicily and exploit its natural resources. This was the first time in history white power and Black power went head-to-head for domination. The world's first race riot. And I quote, other indigenous peoples of the interior between the coast and the Garamantes are labeled Gaetuli, doubtless linked to the semi-nomads of Numidia, and with the Numidia themselves, the most powerful of the Maghreb. The Moors and the Mari of the far west were too distant to affect Lipsis, end quote. The first thing I needed to do was to research the ideology of the Nation of Islam to see if there was a relationship between them and Cassius Clay's I am the king of the world reference. What I found out truly fascinated and intrigued me. First and foremost, I found out that the Nation of Islam was actually a faction of the Moorish Science Temple of America. And I quote, an American organization founded in the early 20th century by Timothy Drew. These adherents also called themselves indigenous Moors or African Americans. Competing factions developed among the congregations and leaders, especially after the death of charismatic founder Noble Drew Ali. In the 1930s, membership was estimated at 30,000, with 1/3 of them in Chicago. The founding of the Nation of Islam by Wallace Ford Muhammad also created competition for members. The Moorish Science Temple of America continued to increase members in the post-war years, but to a slower rate. I truly believed that I had found the white elephant in the room, and in my opinion, this was not a coincidence. Cassius Clay the Nation of Islam, and the leaders of the Black Power movement were secretly encoding messages to the American Negro that we were not Negroes, but kings. The Negroes were not only black, but beautiful, and that we could float like butterflies and sting like bees. We as a people were declaring war on the infidels, a jihad, and it was time to mobilize. History was about to repeat itself, and another holy war was about to begin. This was going to be, as the godfather of soul, James Brown, once put, the big payback for the Europeans stopping the expansion of the Moorish Empire into Western Europe. And I quote, "The peace settlement between Rome and Carthage in 201 BC made Massinissa, who had switched sides opportunely, king of a united Numidia. For over half a century, this remarkable man greatly enlarged his dominions at the expense of Carthage. He repeatedly attempted to take over Emporia. Emporia was Roman Africa. Africa is a Roman word. Was Cassius Clay, the Nation of Islam, actually asking us to go to war? To take up arms and fight to the very last man, woman, and child? Surely this could not be what they were asking of us, because this would certainly be nothing but a suicide attempt. If history has taught us anything, it has taught us that the centralized government has more guns than we do. That is why Gabriel Prosser, John Brown, and Nathaniel Turner tried in their slave rebellions to take over the state armories and fight power with power. But after the 1963 church bombing in Birmingham, where 4 Sunday school Negro children were killed, we as a people had decided that we needed new tactics. And I quote, "The powers of the state are not moved by argument or persuasion, but by force. Be sure that you have the means to answer the establishment's threats of violence in kind. For that is the one and only language it understands. Destroy the state and take back the powers it has stolen from you, so that you might all forge a new world in your own image," end quote. Maybe this time, they, our black leaders, were not asking black people to take up arms, but only to change our tactics. Maybe they wanted us to reclaim for ourselves what slavery had taken from us, and that was our freedom, identity, dignity, traditions, language, and culture. They wanted us to reclaim ourselves as black people. Yes, they were calling for a holy war, a jihad. But the true jihad is the inner war, the inner struggle. They were determined to defeat the enemy, not with bullets this time, but with words. It would be a war between 2 distinct ideologies, a war between racist ideology and black nationalism. What was at stake was one of the greatest principles of the Republic, the basic human right of freedom of speech, and whose right it is to shape the public's opinion and the public's perception. And I quote, "Freedom of speech is the freedom to speak freely without censorship or limitation, or both." The synonymous term freedom of expression is sometimes used to indicate not only freedom of verbal speech, but any act of seeking, receiving, and imparting information or ideas, regardless of the medium used. In practice, the right to freedom of speech is not absolute in any country, and the right is commonly subject to limitations such as hate speech. We would fight for the right to define ourselves on our own terms. And our first act of war would be to reclaim our names. When Cassius Clay changed his name to Muhammad Ali, he was not only taking back his name, but he was at the same time reclaiming his history. The Nation of Islam was acutely aware of how the slave power of the early 16th century effectively destroyed black identity by taking away our names and, in doing so, destroying the meaning of our existence. And I quote, "To understand the meaning of slaves as contested terrain is to set the stage for an appreciation of the problem of Nat Turner's name. It is best to begin with the recognition that legally, in the 19th century Virginia, as in virtually all slave societies, a slave had no surname. This was no trivial matter. The denial of a legal family name was one of the most powerful symbolic ways in which masters asserted their dominance while simultaneously affirming the slavish condition of the people they owned. One distinguishing feature of slavery in the minds of masters was that a slave had no binding legal relationship with kin. Enslaved husbands and wives and enslaved children could make no legal claims on each other. To my great shock, my theory of Muhammad Ali and the Nation of Islam's agenda was not only of interest and concern to me, but also of great concern to the FBI. And here's the FBI report on the Nation of Islam from 1963. That's in my book. Under the United States Department of Justice, Federal Bureau of Investigation, San Antonio, Texas, August 23, 1963, Nation of Islam, formerly known as the Muslim Cult of Islam. So thank you for listening, and I hope to see you again soon. If you like what I just read, please hit the like button and subscribe. And I will be getting into more of this book and more of the FBI fight file in the near future. Thank you very much.